Greetings everyone, and welcome to my presentation for my proposal for the rescheduling of psilocybin in the United States. I'm directing the focus of my presentation towards the current Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar, due to the key role that he and his department play in the rescheduling of substances in the United States. Psilocybin is currently classified as a Schedule I drug in the United States, and Schedule I drugs are by definition substances or chemicals with no currently accepted medical use and also carry with them a high potential for abuse. For a Schedule I drug to be considered for rescheduling, it needs to have gone through 3 phases of clinical trials, which are overseen by the FDA. Upon completion of these trials, the Department of Health and Human Services and the DEA are still needed to give final approval in order for the substance to be rescheduled. Psilocybin is currently in Phase 2B of the FDA clinical trials, and researchers anticipate to be done with these clearance trials sometime within the next 5 years. The goal of my presentation will be to show your department definitively that the research that's come out over the last few decades shows that psilocybin not only has medical value, but also carries with it a low abuse rate potential as well, and therefore justifies a less restrictive classification. Before we look at these 2 important factors, let's take a brief look at the history of psilocybin in the United States and how it found its way onto the Controlled Substances Act to begin with. So, what is psilocybin? Psilocybin is a naturally occurring psychedelic compound found in over 180 species of mushrooms around the world. The mushrooms first found their way into Western society in the late 1950s thanks in large part to the pioneering work of an early mycologist named R. Gordon Wasson. His trips to Mexico and experiences with the mushrooms, known by the locals as flesh of the gods, had landed in an article of Life magazine on May 13, 1957, and was America's first true exposure to the substance. Wasson had gotten some of the mushrooms to a friend of his, Albert Hofmann, and later in 1957, Hofmann had managed to isolate the psilocybin from the mushrooms. In the early 1960s, research sponsored by the National Institute of Mental Health indicated a potential for psychedelic drugs to be used to alleviate depression and existential suffering in patients suffering from cancer. Unfortunately, the drugs had found their way out of the labs and into the hands of the American population during a time where tensions were high, due in large part to the war in Vietnam and the subsequent rise in anti-war protests in the U.S. This explosion of psychedelic use in the public resulted in this class of drugs, psilocybin included, being classified as a Schedule I drug in the United States per the Controlled Substances Act of 1970, and had subsequently ended all research into the compound until the early 1990s. Scientists at Johns Hopkins Medicine became the first to obtain regulatory approval in the U.S. to reinstate research into psychedelics with healthy patients in 2000 and have centered their research around psilocybin. With their efforts and publications appearing in over 60 peer-reviewed journals across the world, Johns Hopkins Medicine has been able to show significant therapeutic level effects in patients suffering from a wide range of conditions including, but not limited to, PTSD, different types of addictions, depressions brought on by life-threatening diseases, cases of treatment-resistant depression, and anorexia nervosa. After gaining insight from the years of new research into the substance, scientists and researchers at Johns Hopkins Medicine had decided to focus their efforts to studying the effects that psilocybin has on patients with life-threatening cancers. Patients in this category often find themselves dealing with symptoms like anxiety, depression, and an imminent fear of death. The study, which saw 51 adult patients in total, was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology in December of 2016 and was done in conjunction with researchers from the New York University Langone Center for Medicine. The results from the studies indicated that psilocybin had decreased clinician-patient-related depressed mood, anxiety, fear of death, and in many cases brought about more life meaning and optimism in patients. Stephen Ross, one of the researchers involved in these studies, from NYU writes, "I thought that the first 10 or 20 people were plants, that they must be faking it. They were saying things like, 'I understand that love is the most powerful force on the planet,' or 'I had an encounter with my cancer, this black cloud of smoke.' These patients, who before the session had been clinging to an impending fear of death, seemed to be traveling deep into the early parts of their lives and coming back with new meaning and understanding of their place in the universe." Currently, the mental health system in the United States is only able to reach a fraction of the people suffering from mental health disorders, often due to the cost, social stigma, and/or ineffectiveness of treatment. In the U.S., there are almost 43,000 suicides annually, which surpasses the total deaths from both auto accidents and breast cancer combined. And only half of those who took their own lives were ever reported to have received mental health treatment. To aid in the finding of a possible solution to these problems, in October of 2018, the FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation to Compass Pathways, a London-based life sciences company who specializes in psilocybin-assisted therapy for patients with treatment-resistant depression. Breakthrough therapy designation was first established in 2012 and allows the FDA to closely assist researchers in the production of compounds that could potentially assist in the treatment of serious conditions or diseases. So up until this point, we've looked at a few of the different potential values and applications for psilocybin, but what about the abuse potential? In an article published in Neuropharmacology, Volume 142, in November of 2018, Matthew Johnson and Roland Griffith's findings seem to indicate that their studies with mice involving psilocybin showed a low abuse rate and a near zero physical addiction rate. The findings in research also showed an incredibly small amount of people were actually seeking out treatment for psilocybin when compared to other Schedule I drugs. So it's my recommendation to the current U.S. Health and Human Services Secretary that upon completion of the third phase of FDA trials, psilocybin be reclassified from Schedule I to Schedule IV. Schedule IV drugs are drugs that have a low potential for abuse and a low risk of dependence, and all of the research seems to indicate that psilocybin checks both of these boxes. I'll also suggest that your office, the DEA, and these researchers work together to build a plan for how to classify psilocybin and how to ensure that it's properly being administered in clinical settings. Psilocybin should not be a compound that many large companies are trying to market to the public and should not be available via prescription at the dosages that are used in these studies. If careful work is done to ensure that these substances are available for both research and therapeutic and/or medical applications, you'd be doing a tremendous service to the millions of people around the globe suffering from the conditions mentioned in this presentation. Researchers at Johns Hopkins University have reported that they pay between $7,000 and $10,000 per gram of psilocybin. The high cost has to do with the stringent process involved with synthesizing psilocybin in a way that conforms with the standards set by the FDA's good manufacturing process. Thanks to the continued research efforts and the manufacturers receiving GMP certification, companies like Compass Pathways have begun to create larger batches of psilocybin and report that the price charged to academics will surely drop as a result. This increase in amount at a lower price will be crucial for Phase 3 of testing, where a much larger pool of people is required to take part in the trials. If we're obligated as citizens to follow the laws set forth by the Controlled Substances Act, the Act itself needs to reflect the reality of the substances and their effects on those who use them. I believe the research I've detailed in this presentation shows that psilocybin may have the potential to act as an alternative agent to manage a wide array of mental health conditions. The only real limitation on the expansion of this research is psilocybin's classification as a Schedule I drug. By reclassifying this substance as something less restrictive, we would be opening the floodgates for research and funding into the possible treatments of conditions mentioned throughout this presentation. Cities across the U.S. have begun to exercise their ability to defy federal guidelines and implement their own measures for decriminalizing psilocybin. In a unanimous vote, the City Council of Oakland, California voted to decriminalize the possession of mushrooms containing psilocybin. This decision came less than a month after the City of Denver narrowly passed a ballot measure also decriminalizing the substance. Politicians around the U.S. have also started to join in on this fight, and as you can see in the slide, recently Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Iowa State Representative Jeff Shipley have both created legislation which would allow easier access to these substances for researchers and scientists. This is where I think it'd be wise to draw a strong distinction between substances like marijuana and psilocybin. It's completely normal for people in some states in the U.S. to go down to their local dispensary, buy some cannabis, smoke a joint, and then go about doing their everyday normal activities. Psilocybin, on the other hand, if done at clinical dosages, has the potential to leave a person in a state which is usually best spent laying down and under the care of a trained sitter. Another risk that must be addressed is that those with schizophrenia should not consume psilocybin for any reason. It's been reported that people with these sorts of mental illnesses, either diagnosed or running in their families, have shown symptoms of these conditions which hadn't been there previously after ingesting psilocybin. So, in conclusion, as I mentioned in my proposed solution, if the Department of Health and Human Services, the DEA, and these researchers can come together to create a plan for the responsible rescheduling and decriminalization of psilocybin, the results would be tremendous and the above-mentioned risks would be drastically minimized. Thank you for your time today. If you'd like to find some more detailed information on anything that was included in my slides, I highly recommend you checking out some of the articles I've listed above. Until next time.